Let me introduce you to Rabbity with her favourite person, Holly. Here's a close-up of Rabbity, and Rabbity recently had her portrait done. So I'm going to show you in this video from the very beginning how a portrait in this style can be done. It's very straightforward. You start with a piece of grey paper, or it could be tan colour, it doesn't have to be grey, and you draw a little line along the bottom ready for the title. And then you can use a pencil to very lightly sketch out the shape. And you might notice I've got the mount card here, so that's really showing me, once it's in the frame, exactly where the edges are going to be. So using the photo of Rabbity, I can make slight adjustments and use a bit of artistic license. So you might notice if you look back at the photo, I actually will squish Rabbity's ear, or rather fold it a little bit more. So I'm looking at the shape of Rabbity's body and her arms and how they sit on her tummy, and just trying to get the big shapes mapped out, just like if I was doing a portrait of a person or a dog. It's exactly the same process. So it's a really nice thing to practice. That strange lump I've got on the right hand side is a putty rubber. So I'm going to use that later on to remove these pencil lines, so they're not going to be on the picture the whole time. But what I do is I map out the picture so I can get Rabbity's proportions right, get Rabbity's hands in the right place, make sure it fits really well inside the frame. And then later I'm going to go over these marks with an ink pen. So you can see I'm being very light to start with, and then as I make decisions about different areas, I go in a little bit darker. Rabbity's had a very exciting life. As a result, she has only one eye, which makes her particularly special. So now, as we get a bit further along the drawing, I'm just defining some of those edges a bit better. It really doesn't take very long, this. And it's the same, as I said, if you're doing a dog or a horse or any realistic portrait, then you can use this same technique. Going in lightly first. That's really a massive helpful trick in general, to just do it without committing too much first of all, and then as you get more confident that the whole picture is broadly right, then you can start going in a little bit darker. And then once I start putting the ink on, I won't be able to change anything. So it's really easy to change things at this stage, which is why I like doing it this way. So then I vaguely write the name very loosely, because this is where the title's going to go, just to make sure that I've got a proper idea of how the size of the writing will best fit. And I always start with the writing, because the writing is probably the trickiest bit. And if I've done the whole picture and then mess up the writing at the end, I have to start again. So I've learnt from experience that it's best to start with that hard writing bit. And also I generally check, before I put pen to paper, I check on that little slip of paper that you saw there. So here I am. I'm not exactly tracing those pencil words. I'm using them as a guide, and I went in very slightly smaller with the ink because I could see I needed to leave a little bit room to get that heart in place and with plenty air around it, because I didn't want the heart to be too squished up against the writing. So all the time I've got an eye on the big picture and how it's going to fit in the frame. I'm just doing a little bit of tidying up, because it's dipping ink and a pen. It's not very precise, and I think that's part of the charm. So you can see that it's just been done by hand and not by a printer. So once the shapes have all been decided in pencil, I can go in with the ink pen. So the reason I do the pencil first is because the ink pen can't be erased. So it's really nice sense of you're putting down the marks and they're going to stay where you put them. So I try and be really careful with this. And because Rabbity is a very light colour, I'm being quite light with these pen marks. If Rabbity was dark brown or dark grey, like many Rabbities are, then I might be a little bit more definite with those pen lines. And also at this point, I'm starting to think about where the light is coming from. So in Rabbity's photo, the light was coming from the right hand side, and actually sometimes I change it in a portrait, but in this case that's perfect. So I can see that Holly took great care to take good photos of Rabbity, and on my website there are guidelines on how to take a really good photo for a portrait, and they work whether it's for a person or a dog or whatever, or a soft toy. And the idea is that you have a very clear sense of the light coming from one side, and that means you can show the form of the subject, so in this case Rabbity, by having a sense of the light coming from one side. I can show shadows, and later you'll see how those shadows go in, and as the shadows go in, that's when the portrait starts to look more 3D, because it's telling the person watching the picture this thing is round and it gets more light on one side than the other side because it's round. So I'm also thinking about texture. So I'm sure that Holly knows every inch of Rabbity's texture and Rabbity's beautiful, really, really well loved fur. And it's really nice to be able to use pen, and I'll show you some of the other things that I use to show that delicious, well-loved texture that these toys get. So I'm just going round. First of all, I'm kind of going round the edges, and you might notice that I'm using a slightly lighter touch on the right hand side, and that's in anticipation of getting that light in and getting the darker shadows on the left hand side. Now you can see I'm being very careful about where I place Rabbity's eye, because the placing of the eye makes a huge difference to the likeness. In fact, everywhere that the features go makes a huge difference, and you'll see when you look at portraits of people or dogs that if something like an eye is slightly off, then it stops looking like them. So it's really important to get those features in the right place, and also to look at the direction of the fur. So this is like doing hair on a person. You really don't have to do every single strand. It's just a few little areas just to tell the viewer's eye what it is that is the texture. And the rest you can just leave for their eye to fill in. It'll fill it in without you having to spell it out with your pen. And again, you might notice I'm very slightly doing more of this texture on the left hand side. So look at the left hand side of Rabbity's face, the left hand side of the ear and the body. That's just starting to hint at those shadows. There's not much more inking to do now. I'm going to do a little bit more of the texture. Need to catch that foot. There we go. And then I'm going to re-dip my pen in the ink and do the next bit of shadow, which is what's called cast shadow. So we're going to be looking at the shadow that the legs and tummy form as it sits on the ground. So we're going to really put Rabbity on the ground now by making these shadows, and you can see they're darker and stronger really close to Rabbity's, where Rabbity meets the ground, and that really helps give a sense that Rabbity's not just floating in the air, she's really well sat down. So I hope that you think it's starting to look like Rabbity now. I'm going to put a few more very subtle cast shadows in. So this is where Rabbity's head and hands start to form a shadow on the body. So it's where the light doesn't really hit Rabbity, and therefore I can be quite strong with those shadows. So I'm going to put a few of them in pen, and they are going to be toned down a little bit later because it's going to have a couple of layers of white and cream pencil on it, which will, what we call knocking back, it'll knock back some of these darks. But I'm going to keep some of the darks all the way through, particularly those shadow areas, because they're really important to show. Even with a light toy, they're very lovely and dark. Okay, so I've put the mount card over here really just to check that Holly's Rabbity sits properly in the mount card. This is just an old one, so it's not a very neat mount card, but it's just allows me to keep an eye on the proportions and make sure I don't need to stretch or shrink any bits. Okay, talking of stretching and shrinking, this is called a putty rubber, and it's a really lovely kneadable rubber. And my ink dries really quickly because my paper is very slightly absorbent, but if you're doing this, you might want to wait a little bit for the ink to dry. You can see I'm being quite careful with that rubber. Usually I might wait half an hour or something to make sure it's really dry before I go in with the rubber, but just to show you, I'm going to just do it rather carefully. So I just work my way all around Rabbity's body, removing all those bits of graphite pencil. And some people do this using a light box. Traditional illustrators used to, and probably some still do, use something called a light box, which is like a window that they put their picture on, and they shine a light from behind, so from underneath the picture, and then they can have their, instead of having pencil underneath, they can have a first version of the drawing, and then the light will shine that through. I don't know if that's making sense, but there are lots of ways that you can help yourself get the picture of your toy onto the page. But this is a nice easy way that I like to do. So pencil first, then ink, and then when the ink's dry, you can very gently rub it out. And in a second I'll zoom in so you can see close up. But you can see that the ink's really quite dry now, so it's fine to rub over the top of it. There we are. Oh, a few more little bits. I think this is probably taking a little bit longer because the ink wasn't 100% dry, so I had to be a little bit careful. But just want to make sure that Rabbity's all clean and the paper's all clean, ready to put the colour in for Rabbity's fur. I wonder what Rabbity thinks about being clean. Some toys don't really like being cleaned. They like to stay exactly how they are. And some toys like to be squeaky clean. Rabbity has got very brightly coloured fur, like about this colour. So this is a kind of off-white, little bit of a warm, slightly creamy colour. And I use Derwent drawing pencils, which I find really nice. Though sometimes you'll see later I have a huge collection of different colours which I use. So I start by filling in, it's called blocking in. So I'm blocking in the colour, not worrying too much about being exact, and really just filling in the gaps so that I can see the big shapes starting to come together. You can see Rabbity starting to come to life. These pencils are really nice. They're very slightly waxy. I use them for portraits of people as well. They look lovely on brown paper too. It's really nice to experiment with different coloured papers and different pencils as well. But they're nice and soft. I'm always collecting coloured pencils. Whenever I come across a pack, I have a look through, and if they've got any good colours, I squirrel them away to my pencil pot, which I will show you in a little while. Because all sorts of toys have all sorts of colours. Sometimes they've got a little bit of fabric, a fabric patch or a cardigan or something like that with different colours on it, and it's really handy to have a good supply of different colours. So Rabbity has nearly finished her first coat of colour. And I usually also colour the heart to match Rabbity. I'll probably do that a little bit later, I think, in this drawing. So there's the initial layer of colour. You can see it's not very, very even. I quite like to show the rough texture. And now I'm going over a few details, just making sure it's filled in. So next, it's time to think about the texture. And for this, I use one of these pens. These are Posca pens, and they're really good, water-based marker, and they've got a nice point, and they sit really nicely on top of the pencil. So just checking it again, checking it's coming out, because I don't want to make any blobs on Rabbity. And then starting to pop in that texture. And although I put the texture all over, you'll notice that I'm doing the opposite to what I did with the black. So I'm putting in the lights and putting more of them on the side that the light's coming on. So if you remember, the light is coming from the right hand side in this drawing. So when you start a drawing, it's a really good idea to sit back and think, where is the light coming from? And then try and keep that in your mind all the time when you're doing your drawing. I'm just giving a little shake there to make sure that the white colour is well mixed in. So I'm doing hints of texture all over. There we go. And this is Rabbity's nose. Well, I probably said the remains of Rabbity's nose. Rabbity has clearly been burrowing in lots of interesting places, and she's slightly worn out her nose in a very, very beautiful way. And then there's her shoulder. And this is also a really good way to show the structure of the toy. So Rabbity's got lovely sort of slightly bulging forearms and quite relaxed, loose upper arms. And when you're doing these highlights, it's a really good chance to try and emphasize those characteristic shapes. There we go. Right, and now for her thumping great big feet. What wonderful big strong feet. I think when Rabbity grows up, she's going to be very tall. And at this point, you might be able to see with the feet, I'm trying to get a sense of those feet coming forward towards the viewer, and being 3D by having those white highlights more on the right than on the left. Do you think this is starting to look like Rabbity yet? What do you think? I'm just going over, fine-tuning those little bits. Don't want to miss any details. So I'm going to put some pink on that nose. Right, what do you think's next? So next I'm going to use a white pencil, and I'm just going to very, very slightly blend that white highlight in. So the ink has dried, it dries very quickly, and I'm just making sure that this pencil is really nice and soft and comes off. So sometimes they get a bit shiny. I use a little piece of sandpaper, that's my top tip, just to make sure that those highlights, it's very subtle, and you might not even be able to see it in this light, but it means that Rabbity just looks that little bit more 3D. And I'm just going over the right hand edges, bringing out that where the sun hits the toy. And it all helps Rabbity feel 3D. Right, here they are. This is my pencil pot. Hello. Look at those. And I've got plenty more as well. So now what I'm going to do is find exactly the right pink for Rabbity's nose. So Rabbity's nose is pink, but as you have probably noticed as you've looked at things, pink is actually lots and lots of different colours. So I have a collection of pinks for all different sorts of noses and inside ears and cardigans and other details. So here's just a few of my pinks. So I'm looking at these pinks, trying to find one that looks right for Rabbity's nose. And I think it's probably this one. So I'm going to try it on the paper. Yep, that looks fine. Sometimes it takes a few goes to get just the right pink. Sometimes they look really different on the pencil to how they look once they're in action on the paper. So Rabbity's got some little bits of pink fabric. Souvenirs, I think we could call them. Souvenirs of Rabbity's nose. And now I'm just going to look at the writing, make sure I've got all those last traces of pencil off, and the heart. And so with the heart I could go pink or white, and I think I'm going to go for this creamy white. And that's one of those things that if somebody has got several toys on their portrait, sometimes I do each toy a heart next to their name, and then the hearts match the toys, which is quite nice. But some people love pink and some people don't. So in this case, I think Holly would probably, I'm guessing, would probably like creamy white. But to be honest, it's all quite changeable. So if Holly decided she wanted a blue heart, I could do a blue heart for her. Right, so next I'm going to go over some of the areas which were done quite roughly, and again this helps to slightly blend in those white highlights, otherwise they can be really bright, and help soften up Rabbity's fur. And then I'm going to, because the white sits on top of the ink, sometimes I need to go in afterwards with the pen and just clarify, so make them a little bit darker, those areas of deep shadow, to make sure that they really stand out and I haven't lost that definition. So you can see I'm going on the areas where there's a kind of it's called an occlusion shadow, or where the really darkest bits are. Obviously Rabbity's not a dark toy, so I don't want to overdo it, but just get a few little bits of definition in there, being very careful not to smudge the ink with my hand, because obviously that ink is wet for a little bit. And with these dipping pens, they're really, and one of the nice things I like about them is when you dip them in the ink, they come out really quite fat and juicy on the paper. And then once you do a little bit more detail, they get less and less juicy. So then you can go into the finer bits. So it's a very fine job making sure that Rabbity's eye is nice and shiny and dark. There we go, and exactly the right eye shape. So a few last bits there, and I think we're just about done with that pen. It's just a good way to make sure that the bits that come forward really pop forward by not doing the bits themselves, but doing the shadows that they cast. And that's a really useful thing to remember. So I'm going to dry off my pen. And Rabbity's nearly finished now. So I'm going to put that mount card back on so that I can look at the way Rabbity sits and start thinking about a frame. So these are my standard frames I use. It's a beautiful grey solid wood painted, and I have spare frames which I keep just for during the process of drawing the picture, just to make sure that it sits nicely in the frame and works. So I obviously would use a fresh frame when I'm framing work for customers, but during the drawing process I find it really good to check that the picture looks good in there. So I've taken the glass out of the frame, and I'm going to stick Rabbity's portrait to the back of the mount card with this special tape that comes off very easily. So it's sort of sticky, but it doesn't damage the paper when you take it off. So that's just to make sure Rabbity sits in there. And the reason I do this is because I'm going to sign Rabbity's picture in a minute, and I want to make sure that I sign it exactly in the right place so it doesn't distract from Rabbity, so people can see it's an original drawing, but the portrait is all about Rabbity. And then sometimes if you frame it, if you sign it before you frame it, what can happen is you can put it in the frame, put the mount card on, and realise that your signature is half poking out of the bottom. So I find it really useful to stick the back in the frame very loosely. I don't do all the tabs. And then I can turn it over and have a look at how Rabbity sits. There we go. These are really beautiful frames. I was so pleased when I found them because they match the paper so well. They're a lovely warm grey. Right, so this is roughly where I'm planning on signing. So I've got my pencil ready, and just like with the ink, I'm just going to check that the pencil isn't too fat or too thin or too dark or too light, and then I can go onto the picture, think about, do I sign it that side or that side? Here we go. I'm going to stick it in there. There we are. Some artists only sign their work on the back, but I think it's yeah. Right, last detail. Rabbity's eye gets a highlight just to make sure it shines. And there we are. I'll zoom out now so you can see. Well, I'll zoom in first. You can see the details. There we go. One Rabbity ready to hang on Holly's wall. I hope Rabbity likes her portrait. And I hope that this has inspired you to have a go. These are the things that I use. I use an ink pen, but you could just use a felt tip if you wanted. And I use a white marker pen. I use Posca, but you could use, there are plenty other brands. I use lots of different coloured pencils, a putty rubber and a graphite pencil. And then some sort of mid-tone paper like this grey paper here. And there we go. Easy peasy lemon squeezy. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this, and I hope that you might have a go yourself, and please do send me your pictures. So thank you to Holly for letting me draw your beautiful Rabbity. She was a great subject.